Hello and welcome to today's program, 30-Minute Essentials, Tariffs and the Expected Impact on the Restaurants. This program is being recorded and is intended for information purposes only. Nothing should be taken as legal advice nor relate to any client matter that may be considered privileged or confidential. Our speakers today are Tony Brown, a corporate shareholder, Riley Lageson, chair to the Global Restaurant Industry Group, and Laura Rabinowitz, an international trade and customs shareholder. If you have a question for today's presenters, please type it into the Q&A box. Riley, you're welcome to begin.
Well, hi, everybody. Hope your 2025 is off to a great start. I'm Riley Lageson. I chair the Global Restaurant Industry Practice Group at GT. Great to see so many familiar and friendly faces on the call today. My practice focuses on finance and growth and development and working with our team of specialists on matters of most critical importance to our restaurant industry clients. We do our 30-minute Essentials series because we believe in providing big value in little time and appreciate the value of your time and you're taking with us today. We welcome suggestions on any future topics, so please feel free to send me an email or message me on LinkedIn. Today, we have a very timely and exciting topic, which happens to be tariffs and the impact on restaurants. Now, this session is meant to be interactive, and we want your questions. And so if you have them, as mentioned previously, insert them through the Q&A feature, and we will try to address everything we can on the call today, or if not, endeavor to follow up afterwards. And now I'd like to introduce our two specialists today. Laura Rabinowitz, she is the international trade lead at Greenberg Traurig. She counsels domestic and multinational businesses on complex supply chain issues and other challenges associated with trade, advising on mitigation of duty exposure and compliance. She has deep experience handling these matters for restaurants, retailers, manufacturers, and consumer products companies, and does much work for restaurants, but also outside of restaurants. So if you need any assistance in this area from the GT team, she is your lead in that department, and we will provide her contact information later in the call. And we have Tony Brown. Tony is GT's restaurant supply chain lead. She served as senior director of supply chain for a multi-brand restaurant company whose portfolio includes over 32,000 locations. She was the primary legal support for procurement and distribution teams responsible for development of a centralized multi-concept contracting process designed to ensure uniform contracting across brands, maximize efficiencies, and drive value. So Laura and Tony, thank you for being with us today. And we're going to jump right in to our first question. I will get the conversation started, but everybody in the audience, if you have questions, please submit those through the Q&A feature. So for our restaurant clients, obviously a lot of what I'd say supply chain anxiety and confusion these days with the conversations on tariffs. Concerns that many have are the obvious exposure to the impact of tariffs on development and operational expenses, cost of food and beverages, obviously utilities and supplies, but also construction, development costs, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So Laura, I'll ask you to get this conversation started. What tariffs are in effect now, will be effective in the near future, or that we might anticipate based on announcements that have been made by the Trump administration that will directly or indirectly impact restaurants? And also a follow-on, not to make more compound questions out of this one because it already is, but how real are the tariffs? Are we actually going to see these implemented, and are there going to be long-term effects? So Take it away, Laura.
Okay, thank you, Riley, and welcome everyone. So, first to say that the Trump administration trade policies is fluid would certainly be an understatement. So in terms of what's in effect today, we have additional tariffs on 100% of the products coming from China. That's 10%. That went into effect on February 4th. I was on calls earlier this morning and I got a pop-up that Trump announced that he may next week impose an additional 10% on China. So that would be 20% on all products of China. And And I should say that the president is making a trade announcement next week, and I think it will be at his address to Congress, which is on Tuesday. So what's in place now are the China tariffs, 10%. Then also we have steel and aluminum. Those are set to go into effect on March 12th at 25% additional tariffs. And that is, there are specific lists, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Then we also have the president announced reciprocal tariffs, and the way those are initially announced, that it would be tariffs on foreign goods coming to the US would be commensurate with US goods going to those foreign countries. So it would be country specific and product specific. But I think that's going to be very, very difficult to implement. And just yesterday, the president floated that his reciprocal tariffs would really be a 25% additional tariff. And he mentioned particularly the EU. He just said that yesterday. And then he also said that in April, there'll be an announcement on cars, chips, pharma, lumber, and then he just added copper. So that would be, and he said it would be around 25% additional duty. So that would be April. And then this week, there was also a Federal Register notice on Chinese ships entering US ports. And that's in the notice and comment period. So that'll be rolled out a little bit slower, probably in the next few months. But those fees on either Chinese ports, Chinese ships entering US ports, or Chinese operated ships entering US ports, those will be quite onerous, what's in the Federal Register. And then Canada and Mexico, I don't think I mentioned, is coming next week. That's 25% additional duty, and that's supposed to start on March 4th. And there's been a lot of conflicting information from the White House, whether that is going into effect next week or not. I mean, earlier this week, the president said those tariffs are coming. And then, the White House yesterday made a statement saying there are ongoing negotiations with Canada and Mexico. And then last night, the president said something else, that they are going into effect. They haven't done enough. And so we'll see next week. But I think that address to Congress is going to shed light on the new tariffs.
Thank you, Laura. Tony, anything on your end?
Yeah, I just want to talk briefly. First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see some familiar names and faces. But just to touch briefly on the impact and the long-term impact, if some of these tariffs, particularly those on our closest neighbors in Mexico and China, do go into effect, we believe that there will be some long-term impacts on supply chain strategies. And, one of the fallouts from prior tariffs in China is a lot of companies and manufacturers and suppliers, implemented strategies to bring things closer to the U.S. There were a lot of nearshoring, and it increased manufacturing and supply, particularly out of Mexico. And so now if we have these tariffs in Mexico go into effect, it's going to impact some of these longer term strategies that companies previously put in place, and take them to, require them to take a harder look at, where they're going to move for the long term. So I think that there definitely could be, some long-term implications on the strategies that supply chain professionals are using. And then from a legal standpoint, how we assist those professionals and our clients in making sure that there is flexibility and adaptability to react to these.
And I would just add to that also that in terms of specific impact for the restaurant industry, in terms of these new tariffs, I mean, there are specific items listed, particularly on the steel and aluminum list, that I think the restaurant industry should be aware of. I mean, it's in terms of construction, it's doors and window frames, stoves and ranges, steel counters, stainless steel, basins, light fixtures, even steel wool scouring pads. And then little things like nails, screw, bolts, brackets, tubes. So it's highly specific. So it's really important. So for companies, if you're, anywhere on the supply chain, if you're purchasing from a manufacturer or you're the end user or even a customer, need to know what those additional tariffs, because for sure we'll see additional duties. And I'll give you just one specific example. An item I worked on recently was a steel step stool from China. So, right, I'm sure most people on the line have a steel step stool either in their home or at their business. And so a company I work with manufactures those in China, imports into the US. So there's general duty of 5% because all products coming into the US have some general duty, unless there was a certain category of free, but most have some duty. Then under Trump 1, we had 25% duty, or a smaller list at 7.5% duty on 2/3 of the products coming from China. This product has 25%, so that's 30%. Now, all products as of February 4th coming from China have an additional 10%. And now this steel step stool is on the steel list, so that's an additional 25%. And I get this question a lot. These tariffs are cumulative. So this company, for the importation of steel step stools from China, as of March 12th, will be paying 65% duty on their product. So, and that's a low cost item. So Riley, your question was about like impact in the industry. I mean, it's country specific, it's sector specific, but it's certainly incredibly broad and deep. And the impact is going to be felt whether you're an importer of a raw material, a component, or a finished product, but quite deep.
Yeah, and one other thing to note just before we move on, Riley, as things currently stand with steel in particular, and Laura, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's irregardless of where the steel is coming from. So a lot of the tariffs are, from a particular country, or imports from a particular country. But with steel, it's not a situation where you can just source it from, a region or another country that's not impacted by the tariff, because it's across the board.
And here's a quick question, hoping you can answer, because it was on my mind. If you're a US based company and you have products manufactured offshore, maybe you're a US company and you have operations in Mexico where you have a subsidiary or an affiliated entity manufacturing products and brought back here, are you able to avoid the tariffs, or are you still subject to those tariffs?
So the basic rule is that the importer of record into the US pays the tariffs. And it doesn't matter if the manufacturer is a US-owned company overseas or not. It's if the products are manufactured outside the US and come into the US, the tariffs are paid by the US importer.
So not an easy circumvention, or not an application, it sounds like. Restaurants obviously order products from a wide variety of countries. There are many company-owned groups that order from all over the world in terms of not just the food and beverage products, but also materials used in the construction, development, and operation of the restaurants. Also, many franchise businesses with global operations, which are requiring purchases from specific vendors and suppliers in different parts of the globe, that may be subject to tariffs or are subject to tariffs. In terms of strategy, what should groups be thinking from your perspective to avoid or mitigate tariffs? I'm talking specifically about US-based companies right now, restaurant operators, franchisors operating here in the US, and whether or not those strategies are impacted based upon whether the group is necessarily based here or a foreign nation, because there are some that have operations in multiple countries. So in terms of planning and strategy for mitigation, what are some of your key thoughts at the moment? Laura?
Yep.
Sure. So first, my mantra is always that companies need visibility into the supply chain to know not just their level 1 suppliers, but where are the components coming from. And so duties coming into the US are based on the classification of goods, the valuation of the goods, and the country of origin of the goods. And then, so there's general duty, and then now we have these additional tariffs. So it's really important to understand your imported product. And I'll give you one recent example that I have with the restaurant industry is a company was importing some refrigeration equipment, and they said, oh, it's country of origin China. So they knew there were going to be these additional tariffs on the product. And I said, so let's look at the product. And the compressor is made in Germany, then it's moved to China for final assembly. And then the finished product is entered into the US. And they were claiming they said country of export is China, so country of origin is China, and they were going to pay the additional duty. And I said, well, customs determines the origin by what is the essential character of the product. And we determined that it was the compressor, and customs agreed with us. So they're able to claim it as country of origin Germany and avoid those additional China tariffs. So looking at classification of goods, origin of goods, in terms of valuation, there are lots of deductions that companies can take. So even though the invoice price may be $100 a unit, if we look at, deductions we can take, we might be able to make it $80 a unit. And there are other ways that we structure the transaction that we can, shrink the value of the goods declared, thereby reducing the duty. And of course, in terms of the basic strategy under Trump 1, it was anywhere but China, but it's under Trump 2, it's much more complicated than that.
So Tony, kind of putting yourself, in the position of counsel or supply chain director for a restaurant group, whether company owned or franchise, but purchasing from different sources from around the globe, how are you thinking about this, and what are you seeing from others in terms of strategy at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, there's not a one size fits all solution. So it's going to be very specific to your particular supply chain, your suppliers, your contracts. And so as Laura was saying, understanding your supply chain and where, your products are coming from, but also understanding the contracts that you have in place. Now, are we recommending that everybody goes and runs out and tries to renegotiate their contracts and include all tariff specific terms in existing agreements? Absolutely not. So you want to be strategic about how you are approaching this, but it's important to know what are in your existing contracts. Do you have exclusivity provisions that would prohibit you from finding alternative suppliers? Are there volume requirements that you have to hit that could be impacted, if you are trying to source from another supplier? Does the supplier have the ability to unilaterally increase prices? Because the thing is, these suppliers have tight margins, and you could try to negotiate some type of allocation of the impact of costs for these tariffs, but unless you have extreme leverage, it's very unlikely that a supplier is going to eat all of those costs. And so what's more likely is going to happen is they are going to try and push that cost down to the buyer, who would ultimately push it down to the end consumer. But you want to try and have visibility on that, or some type of control, so there's not just the ability for the manufacturer or supplier to, have a knee-jerk reaction in anticipation of some of these potential tariffs, trying to, pad their margins and making sure that they're not as impacted. And so, taking a look in your existing agreements to see what are in there, what's your Incoterms, what's the shipping terms, who is responsible for the importation of the products, where is this going to lie? All of these things are going to be important. And then on a go forward basis, identifying those products that are the higher risk, whether it be kind of your material menu items, or, to Laura's example, maybe items that have the potential to be hit by multiple tariffs. And so you want to take a look at those a little bit closer. There are things that we can do and suggest to try and, include some contractual protections and build in a little bit of flexibility in the agreement to make sure that you have the ability to adapt in the event that these tariffs just kind of swing out outrageously, and you're hit with multiple compounding tariffs.
Yeah, and I would say for new agreements, it's really important to have a tight tariff section, and it isn't always looked at so carefully. And keep in mind that, as I said earlier, it's very fluid. So you want to protect whichever party you are in the supply chain, protect that from just having these, exponential increased tariffs.
I think that's a great point, Lauren and Tony. Thinking back 5 years ago at this time, force majeure provisions were considered boilerplate. A month later, after COVID, they were considered one of the most important provisions in any agreement. And those provisions have undergone extensive customization ever since. With tariff provisions, have these historically been a significant area of focus in supply agreements? And for those that have not taken a look at their supply agreements recently, what do you recommend in terms of brands evaluating their current standing and ability to have flexibility in light of what's occurring?
So I can start off on this one. It really depends. So it's not, I wouldn't say that it rises to the level of traditional boilerplate where you're going to see tariff language in every agreement. I think that when you do, it's at a very high level, and there hasn't been as much focus on it, but there will be, I anticipate, a spotlight on tariffs. I would not be surprised if we started seeing tariff language in force majeure. I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing tariff language in termination rights. But again, it's not a one size fits all. And so you want to be specific on, when and how you're including tariff language in your agreements, because you don't want to preempt a situation where the manufacturer or supplier, if you're on the buyer side, sees that as a sign to try to kind of pad that impact by increasing your pricing. So, you have to weigh out the risks versus the reward, and again, making sure that you are making decisions that are aligned with the actual products and where they flow in the supply chain and where the countries that product is going to be hitting. If you have something that's completely domestic, which again is kind of rare, because even if you're purchasing from a US based manufacturer, there still could be components of that product that come from other countries. But to the extent that the vast majority of that product is produced and manufactured in the US, you may not need, as stringent tariff language in the agreement. And so you want to be mindful of, how you're using it and what you're putting in there, so that you're not creating a situation where the other side sees it and views that as an opportunity to try and, get you on the pricing.
Yeah, and I would say we started looking at production agreements under the first Trump administration, in addition for tariffs, but also because of forced labor, which was the number one enforcement issue for U.S. Customs until now. We have the tariff issue. But so we started looking at production agreements and supply chain, and companies were getting visibility into their supply chain and doing a risk analysis and figuring out where they are in the supply chain and who bears the responsibility for imports and who's going to share the responsibility if there's a problem. In the case of forced labor, it would be a detention. It wasn't over money. It was, you actually might not get your goods. So whose responsibility it is to provide documentation and support and figure all this out. So I think this will just continue that, but I highly recommend looking at production agreements. And also I would say what's important to keep in mind is that duties are calculated as of date of entry. So sourcing people have, they take the long view, and production agreements are negotiated months before entry of merchandise into the US.
How can our good friends and clients on this call use the current tariff landscape to their advantage? How can they come out ahead, if at all?
Ooh, that's a hard one. To their advantage, maybe if you're on the supplier side or the manufacturer side, you may use this as an opportunity to add a little bit of cushion to your margin or increase your pricings because of anticipated additional costs. Now, does that is that a benefit kind of to the overall system in the long run? No, not in my opinion. It's not. I think that the idea behind the tariffs, or at least how it's been communicated from this administration, is that it's supposed to, benefit domestic industries and bring, manufacturing and supply back to the United States. But I think that it's taking a very limited view and not taking into consideration, the ability for U.S. industries to meet all of this demand. And it's not something that, we can ramp up overnight. And we are, a global supply chain. If the pandemic, one of the things that we learned is that, we're all interconnected. And so I think that it's taking a narrow view and trying to use something to solve a problem that is ultimately going to create additional problems.
And I would say we're looking for a silver lining, just going back to my original, mantra, as I said, that companies should have visibility into their supply chains. And I think a lot of companies didn't. And now this forces them to have that and look at, in particular, for example, valuation. So companies that are importing from Canada or Mexico since the mid 1990s, when NAFTA was negotiated, their merchandise was coming in duty free. And now all of a sudden they might pay 25% starting next month. So companies are saying, well, what is the valuation of my product? And they should understand the valuation. How do we arrive at that $100 a unit? And maybe it should be $80 a unit. So, taking any legal deduction and structuring it the way it should be. So maybe that's the silver lining, visibility.
Well, I think maybe we're all on this call right now talking about supply chain, and we're talking about supply chain efficiency. And a lot of restaurants, especially ones that are smaller and haven't really had the time or effort or resources to place attention on it, or in agreements with providers, both with products, technology providers, equipment, FF&E, or anything else, really looking at supply chain and paying more attention, because a lot of groups are leaving money on the table. There are some groups, the more established ones, that do have the resources. They manage their supply chain and they make it work for them, and they make margin on that. And for those on the call, it should not be an afterthought that have not done so. That looking at these agreements and negotiating them to their best of your ability can help with the bottom line, and setting a foundation for that can really benefit the organization. We're running low on time here. We do have a question to get to, and certainly if anybody has questions following the session, we'll get to those as well. But this concept is not necessarily on tariffs on point, but it's related to something on a lot of people's mind. It's from a breakfast-focused concept that says eggs are destroying their cost structure, and we feel for you. Anybody, remember chicken was doing the same for folks a few years ago, and it happens every once in a while that certain product costs will get out of control. But other than raising menu prices, what are options and how long will this last? I don't know if there's any insight for anybody on the egg issue at the moment, but if you have any, please share. I will take that as this is a good time for everybody, to be thinking about menu diversification. In terms of, we have many clients that are, product centric or focused on a certain type of cuisine. Many that sell a lot of guacamole and margaritas, or other products that typically come from other nations, and really understanding how that interplays with your supply chain management, your negotiation with your vendors, but also looking at alternative products. And for those on this call, I know we had many a few years ago with chicken, when prices spiked to unnatural and unseen levels, that started to diversify their offerings to be, creating, different menu items, not using so much of a product, or using smaller portions, or just figuring out ways to make it work. But we do not have visibility into when the egg issue, the crisis will finally abate, but it will, so hang in there. But thank you for everybody for attending. We will put our contact information up here right now. To the extent anybody has questions from any of us, feel free to reach out or send us messages on LinkedIn. We welcome your further questions on tariffs, and we also welcome your suggestions for future 30-minute essential sessions. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a great rest of the week.